So thanks everyone for attending this quick workshop on managing virtual teams put on by the Georgia CTSA. I think everyone can see my screen. So let's get started with some introductions. So I am Christopher Wiese, and I'll let Marissa actually introduce herself first. Marissa, if you want to introduce yourself.
Okay, and I'm not sure. Let's see. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're just fine.
Okay, I wasn't sure if it was working or not. All right, so I am Marissa Scheffler. I'm an associate professor at Clemson University in industrial organizational psychology, and my background is in virtual teams and virtual work, but also more broadly speaking, leadership, training, and teaming for healthcare, for engineering and science teams, and for high-risk environments such as space and construction crews. So excited to be joining everybody today.
Yes, and I am co-hosting or co-facilitating this session with Marissa, and I am Christopher Wiese. I'm assistant professor in IO Psych at Georgia Tech, and I look at teams in various contexts, isolated, confined, high-stress environments. I look at multi and interdisciplinary teams, and Marissa and I have written at least 1 or 2 papers on virtual teams, which we'll be talking about today. Before we get started, I just wanted to cover what some learning goals and what you'll actually be learning today and what you won't be learning today. So today we'll cover things like what are the challenges for virtual teams and how can leadership overcome these challenges. And we'll leave you with some best practices and recommendations to hopefully that you can take away for your virtual teams. What you won't learn today are detailed instructions on how team effectiveness and team dynamics, how do you build an effective team, dealing with conflict on your team. But good news, the Georgia CTSA is going to be putting a series of team skills workshops in the future focused on these things. So things like building your team, how you develop your team over time, how to communicate effectively, leading the team, which will be great outside of the virtual context. So we'll cover a lot of those, and you'll be hearing about them soon. But today's session is really focused on helping you turn a team of experts into an expert virtual team. And so before we get started with the content, I wanted to make sure that the features of Zoom are working correctly. So we're going to be using 2 sort of interactive components of Zoom. One is question and answer, and sometimes in the webinar they have the feature. We're not fancy like that. We just have the chat box. So if you want, just throw into the chat to everyone, where are you currently working? And just so you can get familiar with that feature that we'll be using today. So I'll type mine, in as well. So just message to everyone. There we go. I don't even need to do it. Everyone's, that is a long title. Perfect. Lots of folks from Emory, a couple folks from Chua, UGA, and Morehouse all represented here today. Fantastic. So the second feature that we're going to be using is the polling feature. And so let's get this started. So you'll see a poll popping up on your screen momentarily, and go ahead and answer that. I want to become a great virtual team leader. Let's see. Wow. Seems like you are all in the right session for this. So we'll be using these 2 features, the question and answer through the chat. Joey Willis, you should have had something pop up on your screen. That's the actual poll. You don't need to see it in the chat. So I'm going to end the poll now, and then share the results with all of you so you can see that everyone here wants to become a great virtual team leader, which is fantastic. And to start off with the content, I'll have Marissa. Marissa's going to start off with talking about virtual teams.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So, and if you want to just hop on over to the next slide there, say, I think, unless I have those capabilities. There we go. Yeah, I'll just jump right there. Okay, so you are all here today. You're all here in the right session to learn a little bit about virtual work and virtual teams. And I'm sure that every single one of you is clearly already working in those types of environments right now, maybe not necessarily by choice, but you probably were working in them before, and you may not have even really realized how much virtual work you were doing before the spring and with the onset of the pandemic. So what we wanted to just kind of highlight here real quick is that it really is the case that we are all working in virtual environments. We're using different tools, different technologies to communicate, to do our work, to achieve our goals. And it's important, and there's a lot of really great advantages of understanding the value of virtual work. So some of the different types of teams that you'll see, and that you probably all had some experiences with, are things such as your own research labs, your grant teams, your either as students or in teaching your students, serving as in-class projects, having different centers that work together, bringing together different collaborators from different environments to coordinate, really being able to bring experts together. I think it's one of the nice advantages of virtual teams, that you can really capitalize on different expertise from all over the place and having different roles and responsibilities for those different folks on the team. So next slide, please. So again, and these are just kind of getting into a little bit more of different advantages. So I think right now it can be easy to think about all the potential challenges, but first we want to just hit on, there are some values to working in these environments. So being able to have reduced travel times and costs, again, bringing together folks across different environments with different expertise, bringing together different creativity, having innovation really happen because you can pull different folks together. And really being able to get your task work done a lot more effectively because you've got all these different tools and resources out there that can really help serve in a lot of ways as kind of a repository for your knowledge, and being able to help store and track the information that everyone's sharing can really be a benefit there. Okay, next slide. So great things certainly that can happen in virtual environments, but I'm sure that all of you have at least one challenge that you're facing right now. So can you go into the chat and send that message to everyone, asking or telling us a little bit about what are some of the challenges that you're facing in those virtual environments. So in all the virtual work that everybody's doing. All right, starting to see a couple, yeah. That connectivity between folks, absolutely. Having engagement for sure. Yes. Getting everybody on the same page, coordination, absolutely. So we get a few others here. Yes, having consistent communication, that's a really great point, yes, for sure. Grant writing, yes. All right, so we've got some great, more come up here. Yes, having issues with the translating between the virtual world and reality and what we need to do, connecting everyone, communicating, lots of really, communicating is huge for sure. And we'll hit on that in our conversation here in a bit. So certainly lots of challenges that come up here, lots of issues that can come up. So communication, obviously, is one of the biggest ones. Having challenges with the frequency of your communication and feeling like it might be less rich. Having some ambiguity in your communication, not always knowing. I like to tell my students, my colleagues, that I tend to be a very sarcastic person, but sarcasm does not have a font. You cannot translate sarcasm very well sometimes. And so that can be especially challenging in virtual environments and the way that we're working together right now a lot of our time. Time zone differences can be a challenge. Sometimes we can make it work to our advantages, but it can be difficult trying to coordinate a meeting. If you need a synchronous meeting with 5 people who are all in different time zones, that can be a bit of a challenge. And with that comes challenges and differences in our cultural diversity and our tech norms. What we like to use to work together may not always be the same as the tools we like to use, may not be the same tools that everyone else likes to use in the team. certainly challenges there. So next slide. So one thing that we want to kind of really focus a little bit of our talk on today is that, especially for all of you as leaders, as folks who are going to be in charge of and managing virtual teams and virtual work right now, what are some of the things that we can learn from the existing science of teams to help you with that? And so that's what we're here to offer, some advice and some tips. This is kind of an organizing framework to think about. It's always, I think, helps to have a nice little fun heuristic. And so we've got the 6 T's of teamwork, or 6 T's of virtual teamwork that we're going to be talking about today. And really what this is just a way to organize some of the science, the evidence out there on how to make virtual work a little bit more efficient, a little bit more effective. These come from actual studies of teams in the wild, real working teams, real organizations, and they are designed to address teams that are using virtual tools that are composed of very diverse, culturally diverse and organizationally diverse members, and of course, working over time and space. So I'm going to let Chris start us off by talking about, I think, one of the most important ones, which is the technology component of this.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of you mentioned technology in terms of communication being a barrier to effectively leading your team, and that it's absolutely true. Different individuals have different preferences. The way that we like to think about it is there's 2 main issues as a leader you need to be thinking about when selecting your technological tool that you're going to be using for your project. 1 is functionality fit, and 2 is engagement. And obviously, Marissa and I like XKCD, as you've seen a couple of comics from them scattered throughout this presentation already. Technology tools provide 3 general services, right? They provide project management function. So this is your tasking, who's going to do what, when is it due, tagging people in order to make sure that a project is moving forward. And there's many different softwares and apps that you can use for that. They can also provide communication services. So communication, as Marissa, I think we'll talk about in a bit, is the foundation of all teamwork. And so obviously there's going to be the most amount of choices when it comes to selecting the communication tool that you're going to utilize, everything from Discord to Slack to WhatsApp to Messenger to what we're going through now, which is Zoom, BlueJeans, Teams, etc. They can also provide data storage as well. So there's apps like Box, Google Docs, Office, Evernote, and many more. But when you are actually selecting the tool that you want to work with, we can't recommend any particular tool here, and we shouldn't, because it's all about the fit, right? So when you're selecting the tools that provide these services, you need to think about what functionality meets my team's need. So not every team is going to need a GitHub repository where they're storing code, but some might. Dropbox may work for some folks. However, Dropbox may not meet the security protocols, so you need to ask of certain funding agencies. So you need to ask which tools align with the security protocols required of the project or the sponsor. It's also important to ask what tools easily integrate with one another. Slack has all of these add-ons for all of these different other services like Google Docs and Dropbox, and sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. So it's important to consider that when selecting the tool that you're going to be that you're working with. A kind of more practical question you need to ask yourself is, what tools already under contract by with my organization or the organization of the teams that I am. The team members that I'm working with, if you have just geographically distributed team. It's practical because you don't want to spend money if you don't have to on these tools. And another facet is what tool can your team members actually use? I have grad students who are currently in China, and it's really hard to use things like Zoom over there or Hangouts. So we have to resort to whatever is compatible with the Chinese internet. And I think what's most important and related to the next topic is what tools my team likely to use. And that gets us to, oops, next slide, engagement. So how do you actually get folks to engage or utilize these different technological tools? The best thing that you can do is use them yourself, even if it seems like no one else is using them. A lot of the times, like when setting up my lab, for example, at Tech, I wanted to use Slack as a communication tool, and I would consistently still get emails. So one of the things that, this is an uncomfortable email to write, but one of the things that I wrote is like, how about, I messaged you on Slack about this. I would email them, hey, can you look at Slack? And it feels awkward at first, but eventually once they get into the habit of checking and using Slack, it becomes much easier. And so all of these recommendations here are actually about building up the habit in your team members in using these technological tools. Another way you can do that is use them for social purposes. So these communication tools are great for, say, communication, as we mentioned. So schedule a weekly question and answer session that that folks will kind of feel socially compelled to, answer. How things are going with the quarantine has been an effective use of these tools. In teaching my undergraduate class on Intro to IO, this is actually something that one of their teams used. The leader was asking questions, what's your favorite ice cream or something like that, and it would actually get them to use this technological tool and engage more in synchronous communication because they're more often on these platforms. Data storage. If you want to kind of organize a virtual shared lunch where everyone's ordering the same type of food, you can do that with Google Docs or something like or something similar. Project management, you can organize virtual birthday parties through, say, Trello. So there's many different ways that you can utilize these tools that aren't necessarily task related, but builds the habit in your team in utilizing them. I think one of the most important things is making sure that your team is trained on how to use them, which actually gets to our next poll. So if you see all of these symbols up here, you may recognize them, but you may not be super familiar with them. So for this poll, I'm going to ask you, how confident do you feel using the virtual tools that you recognize but seldom use? So I'm going to bring up that poll now and launch it. So I'll give you a minute to answer these questions. So these are the tools that you've heard of but don't often use. All right, so we got about 70% of the folks responding, and I got to say that we have a very confident group. Most of you said that you're somewhat confident using these tools, which is exactly the opposite answer that we were looking for as facilitators. Because a lot of the times that you may not be incredibly sure on how to use all of the features of a particular technology. Aaron says to everyone, you don't know what you don't know. So it's important that we get to the next T, which is training. And let me see if I can close this poll because it's in the way and I can't see the slides. And I can, yep, there we go. All right, training before and after. So when you're bringing together a virtual team or a team that needed to transition to being virtual, you select your members on expertise, not how technologically savvy they are or their teamwork skills. How many times well, how many times in your potential graduate student interviews do you ask about their tech savviness if you're not a CS major, or how well they work with teams, or their teamwork skills, or give them an exercise to demonstrate these skills? It's not very often. So you select them on their capability to do particular tasks, not necessarily how they work with other people or how they can use Zoom. So for working virtually, this really means that you need to have some sort of training. Luckily, there's tons of online services or online videos on how to use these virtual tools. So it would be great if you're saying a lab manager to organize a training session around how to utilize the tools that you're using for a particular project before the project actually gets started. Over time, you need to assess and develop task expertise, which you've already done, but their skill, comfort with technology, their willingness to work as a team, and as Marissa will talk about later, their leadership. What, a leader, not someone who is not a leader performing leadership? That's crazy. No, we'll get to it in a minute. But so afterwards, you need to debrief and learn. So I think it's super important that you make sure with any training that you have, whether it's for technological skills or task development, that you debrief afterwards and explore to see if there's any issues that you need to correct. That's the perfect time for some sort of guided self-correction and guided team correction. And then I think we need to talk about transnationality and transdisciplinary issues. So we talked about it as part of some of the disadvantages here. And it is a large disadvantage. There's a lot of virtual teams communicate in an asynchronous fashion. So you get that's like email or something. You get an email, you wait for somebody to respond, and they don't get back to you until much later, potentially because they're in a different time zones. One of the benefits of having a virtual team is that you can collaborate across time zones. One of the things that a lot of us teaching faculty ran into was access to technology. So, if you have a lot of international students traveling home, or individuals who aren't necessarily able to access the sort of technology you needed to teach or convey the teaching materials, that's a large barrier. So it's always important to ask about that before you start collaborating on a virtual project. There's also social challenges. So some generational differences between the use of particular technological norms. So, a lot of folks may just want to use IRC as a chat feature and don't want to learn any of these newer technologies are out there. And jargon, language differences are also problematic. So what's the solution here? Be cognizant in assigning asynchronous work. If there's a project in which you need multiple people to collaborate on, make sure that they're in the same time zone, or be cognizant of that and make them aware before assigning something to them that these individuals are in different time zones. It's also important at the very beginning, as that last bullet point says, to develop a culture that respects different points of view, whether that is from different functional backgrounds or whether it is from different cultural backgrounds. And it's really hard, but sometimes you just got to not use jargon and explain it in larger, in more detailed descriptions. Jargon is awesome when everyone's on the same page, but if everyone's not on the same page, then jargon can be particularly harmful. And so I'm going to transition over to Marissa now to talk about talking.
Yes, thanks, Chris. So I'm trying to also keep up with a couple of questions here that we've got, and a couple of comments that have been popping up. So yes, we will, and we'll have a chance to also answer some of the questions in just a little bit, and folks are welcome to add in questions as we're going through here. So I think that one of the things that is so important whenever we're in these virtual environments and working together is this idea of talking, but really this is just our way to kind of describe communication. So obviously the communication component is the foundation of all of this. Everything that we're doing is driven by our communication, what we say and what we don't say, both in terms of the spoken and the unspoken, the written and the unwritten, whenever it comes to communicating. So some of the issues and challenges that we've seen in terms of communication come up whenever there are some of those disconnects or some of the even I think that this is a great point earlier from Susan about the use of the word jargon, wanting to use technical terminology instead. And so those types of things are great communication issues to point out in terms of preferences and differences, and I think important things to acknowledge in terms of communicating, having to clear some of those up along the way. And that's part of being able to try and be open and being able to kind of communicate and talk more than just about the task at hand. So one of the challenges that we see and some of the research that I've done on virtual teams has really pointed out the fact that when we get in virtual environments, we tend to jump right into whatever it is that we're supposed to be doing. We don't spend a lot of time kind of connecting with each other, having a chance to kind of get to know each other a little bit. There can be a tendency to want to just get to the task, get it done, get it over with. And some of that is because there is so much going on, and there are so many challenges that you're overcoming and technical issues that may be coming up, and so it may be hard to want to spend time kind of having conversations, that water cooler chatter that you might hear and might be used to in a typical office setting. However, it's really important in virtual environments to be more open in our sharing and to not just share it once, but maybe share it multiple times because of some of those challenges and issues. So I work with a lot of healthcare providers right now and in emergency medicine. And there are things where we're working with the leadership, and the leadership think that they have clearly stated information, multiple times in multiple ways, but due to the nature of the work, it doesn't always get communicated to everyone at the same time. So that's something that they have really tried to focus on, and we try to remind them that maybe sharing information multiple times in multiple ways in multiple contexts will help to, especially if it's a really important point. And really important information to be sure that it is communicated as much as possible sometimes. And that really seems to be helping in that case in particular. So that's just something to kind of think about with that. All right, next slide, Chris. So, and along those lines, so one of the things that that being open and kind of being able to share more in our communication, one of the reasons why it's so important is that it does kind of help to set the scene for factors of trust and what we call psychological safety. And this is something where, especially as a leader of a team, it's really important. Your role really is to try and help set the right tone and set this the climate for developing trust and developing safety in sharing information amongst your team members. So trust is this concept, and I'm sure that we all have kind of your own definitions of what you feel like, what does trust mean to you? From a psychological perspective, we consider it to be the confident, positive expectations about the conduct of others. So I confidently believe that Chris is going to hit those forward those slides and not just jump in and start taking over whenever he feels like it, and that he's going to actually continue to present along with me today and not just kind of drop off and go do something else this afternoon. So having that trust is really important because it does set that ability to be able to rely on others and be able to support one another, help each other, and know that if I ask someone to do something, that it's going to happen, and they can ask the same of me. Psychological safety is one that may be a little less familiar for everyone, but this is the concept of being able to really throw those crazy ideas out there, share information that might be sensitive, share creative ideas that may feel silly to you, but maybe important, or in the case of some, as I said, like with healthcare, being able to share that either you've made a mistake or that there's been an error made by someone else and not feel like there's going to be a repercussion by being open, being honest, telling the truth. So this is a really important thing for leaders to focus on. And you go to the next slide here, just a couple of things that you can think about in terms of how to both manage and kind of build and engender trust and psych safety in your teams, are to really establish expectations and to walk and talk it yourself. So being able to be vulnerable yourself, especially as a leader, being able to admit your mistakes, admit when you're wrong, put yourself kind of in that vulnerable position. This is something that is really important to creating and maintaining psychological safety. This is where, as faculty members, you can get your students to feel comfortable speaking up in a group discussion or giving their ideas, because if you're giving them encouragement, and if you're throwing out your own crazy ideas at the same time, it really helps. And then also wanting to be curious, support different opinions, explore different ideas. Another big component here. One thing that we do want to mention here is to, as you think about trust, it isn't just always about trusting everyone blindly and openly, because this can lead to other issues. This can lead to everyone, kind of going along with the flow, even though they may not completely think that it's the right thing. But if you, kind of do that, then you may lead to kind of the sense of groupthink and being kind of challenged and not challenging others, and may end up down the wrong path. So having a chance to maybe have some uncomfortable conversations, kind of pointing out and questioning can be a really good thing, as long as you're creating that tone along the way that this is meant to be supportive, meant to be developmental, meant to be something that will help everyone. All right, next slide. So our last T here really goes back to what we started with, which was the idea of leading and taking charge. But one thing that you want to keep in mind with virtual environments is that there are a lot of things going on. There are a lot of components to manage, and it can be difficult enough to manage them face-to-face. So what we want to point out here is that you don't have to always do it alone. You need to think about who else in my group, who else in my team might be able to take on leadership responsibilities. And one thing I like to think about here is that we probably all have been in that team where you've had a leader who is great at either managing the relationship side of things. So they're great at getting people to connect, getting people to share, getting people to be involved, getting along with each other, but you lose focus of the task. You might lose focus of what you're supposed to be doing. You also have the other side of things where you have someone who's a great task manager and keeping everyone going and getting things finished and getting things done. But by the end, we all are just tired of working together. We can't stand each other, and we don't ever want to be in that group again because they have ignored the relationship aspects. So sometimes you really want to play to the strengths of the people in your group. And I'm kind of playing on this a little bit by by giving the example of the Orpheus Orchestra. If any of you are familiar with Orpheus, it is a conductorless orchestra. And so think about that in terms of what that means. That means that it's different folks having to step up and take on those responsibilities of leading others at any point in time, and really playing to their strengths and playing to their capabilities to be able to do that. So that's really part of virtual environments, is really think about the opportunities to play those strengths and get people to work together effectively in those environments. All right, so next slide here. So now is our chance to answer questions, anything that you may have. We do have some additional kind of best practices coming up here, but right now, any other questions that folks would like to throw out there? I think that one thing so I see the comment from Aaron earlier about how do you recover? How do you change plans? How do you kind of mitigate that harm? That's really where the idea of something like a debrief can come in. So there are structured tools out there called team debriefs, and it's a chance to really use, kind of take a step back, look at your team and say, okay, this did not go well. How do we correct from here? And there are some structured protocols and some resources out there. I would strongly recommend taking a look at that, because I think that would be something to look into for sure.
And some of the, to just right on those coattails. Some of the recommendations that we're going to provide in terms of empowering teams and having a team contract, these are all things that are best done at the beginning, but can be done throughout the team's life cycle. So if you didn't do a great job setting up expectations at the onset, or presenting a framework for how conflict will be managed, which are what the welcome letter and team contract aspects recommendations do it later. It's never too late to do these things, and that can absolutely help you mitigate at least future harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is another great kind of comment here from Adrian about finding it difficult to let go of others, or let go of control and let others take on tasks. I completely understand. I can honestly can be the same way sometimes. And I think what it really comes down to is being able to identify strengths in folks and kind of playing on those strengths and playing on those opportunities where you can recognize, okay, here's something that they have maybe done well in the past, and let me see if I can maybe give this piece to them. So kind of think about what you feel, maybe what small pieces you might feel comfortable with being able to kind of let go of to start with. And you may actually get nicely surprised. I think that's one thing that I found is that it's really nice sometimes to give those those little things over to folks and provide that opportunity for them to kind of really excel and demonstrate their capabilities. And I think that helps to build that trust. It helps to build that psych safety as well. And that's really the benefit of this as well, is that folks who may then see that and start to also step up and take on other, you may be able to kind of spread that further and say, okay, well, who else maybe can take on something that that might be able to be better off by passing along to someone else instead of just trying to handle it all yourself.
Completely agree. And it's important to recognize that when you do things like that, there is a risk associated with it, right? So being comfortable with taking that risk, I think, is very important yourself. Like Marissa was saying, you feel like you're confident in them and you can give it to them, but you need to be able to take that risk in trusting them, right? Because at the end of the day, it's probably not that big of a risk after all. But feeling okay that you can take these actions and assigning them things to do is extremely important.
All right. If you have any other questions, we'll hop along here. So next slide.
Yep. There we go.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So over to Chris now about these. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll talk about two of these best practices and recommendations that we have here. Out of the three, Marissa will end up with talking about planning for team meetings. So a lot of text here, but the first recommendation is, I think, uber important. Having some sort of team contract / welcome letter, some sort of psychological contract with your team, but actually on paper. So it's super important when setting up the team, but as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't necessarily need to happen at the beginning when you're first forming the team. What these contracts do is they make sure that everyone's on the same page. I remember someone saying earlier that not everyone's on the same page. Well, I don't know, the team may not have a contract or a welcome letter. It provides everyone, it provides the overarching mission of the project. It establishes these norms and expectations. For example, we talked about there's various communication strategies or communication tools that are out there. In the team contract, you can start setting expectations about which tool this team will be using. So kind of setting the groundwork for them to utilize this tool, when, how, and where you will communicate with one another. It also establishes not only your own roles and responsibilities, but those of your teammates. And that's extremely important in developing Emergent states that we talk about in the teamwork literature of shared mental models and transactive memory systems. Basically knowing who does what on the team, who you need to go to if you have a problem, or knowing someone else's expertise if you need to rely on them for a little bit. Importantly, a team contract can also link an individual's efforts to the overarching mission. So it gives them a perceived meaningfulness in how their actions are actually tied to the larger project goals. Importantly, and this is going to come up and no matter what team that you have, especially if you have a creative team, you're going to have some sort of conflict. So it's important to have some sort of conflict resolution strategies beforehand, or even as your team develops, so people know how conflict is handled. If there are disagreements or things, if everything's going to be on the leader gets to decide when there's some sort of task conflict, then that's your rules and guidelines. If you're going to take a vote, a popular vote or consensus, it's there in the paper. There are guidelines to help set up expectations of how conflict is going to be handled. It's also great for highlighting support networks. For example, where people can get resources, whether they need lab access or how to get participant funds, how to enter the building, how to what you need to go to access the data repository. This is all within a team contract that you can have everyone walk through. It's like a syllabus at the beginning of class, right? You walk through it, set up these expectations. Here are all these resources, and make sure that everyone checks everything off. You may not have a syllabus quiz like some of us do, but everyone signs it, so at least there's some sort of obligation that they've gone over it. But it's also, unlike a syllabus, it's important to develop this with your team. So if you're so familiar and comfortable with using Hangouts, but most of your team already uses Slack, that's a great conversation to have. So you can learn how to use this new technological tool that 90% of your team already uses. So develop this together with your team at the onset. I think that's, or later on, that's very important. It's also, as Marissa talked about earlier, a leader is not the only individual on a team exhibiting leadership responsibilities. And some people may feel uncomfortable engaging in sort of leadership functions. So it's important as the formal leader of your team to empower your team members. You don't want to stand in your own way. So if you have a large project, which most of us do, you don't want it to bottleneck with you. It's okay to empower your team members to do the things that you commonly find yourself doing. So encourage them in leading discussions, encourage them, all the different voices and opinions to talk during team meetings, having them run a team meeting. You want to flatten your team, I think, as much as possible by empowering your team, again, as much as possible. So distributing that power throughout your team is incredibly important. And also feel free to let them delegate to other team members and even yourself. Marissa's going to close us out, I think, with team meetings here.
Yes. So one thing that we are all doing right now, whether you've had lots of experience doing them in person and now you're probably doing lots of them virtually, but it's this idea of our team meetings being a big part of our work that we're trying to accomplish. And so as we're conducting team meetings, I think that one of the issues that we run into is that there may be the sense of we need to have a meeting. Well, do you really? I think that's always the first question you need to ask is this something that needs to be accomplished with a meeting? What is it that we're going to achieve through a meeting that we can't do through email, that we can't do through a shared document? What is it that we need to do that only having everyone together at the same time is going to achieve? So that's always the first question you should ask yourself is, do we really need to set this up as a meeting, or is there maybe a better way to do it? If the answer is yes, if you do need to have a meeting, then I highly recommend putting a little bit of time and planning into the meeting itself. I know it can be easy to set up a meeting and then realize 5 minutes before it's supposed to start, oh yeah, I need to make sure we have an agenda together, or that we have things kind of planned out. What really will help and what will pay off dividends in the long run is to spend a little bit of that time up front doing a little bit more planning, maybe more than you normally would, in terms of the amount of effort that you put into planning the meeting, because you'll get a lot more out of it in the end. So setting up and going ahead and having a clear plan for facilitation. And this may be, again, as Chris was mentioning, kind of that coming through and and having one of your other team members be that facilitator. You don't have to be the facilitator of every single meeting. Just because you called the meeting doesn't mean that you have to be the one to facilitate it. But you want to think about kind of, what is the structure? What are the roles of different individuals in that meeting? Maybe have someone be the timekeeper for your meeting, and have a clear agenda that has timings structured to it. This doesn't mean that you have to, if certain conversations get going or something happens that that you really are getting a lot out of the meeting, or that part of the meeting, doesn't mean you have to completely stick to that strict agenda, but it does mean that you will have a plan in place so that you do have kind of a plan for accomplishing everything you want to in that meeting. Spending a little bit of time with, again, that socializing component, having a chance to kind of, again, clarify what are the norms, what are the roles. For virtual meetings, taking some time to make sure that you let everybody know, are you going to have your video on for this meeting the whole time? Maybe it's that you want everybody to say hi real quick on video, and then you're going to turn it off, and that's okay. It's okay to be muted. It's okay not to be muted. What are the expectations of the structure, so that everybody's on the same page throughout the entire meeting? I think that can go a long way for making these virtual meetings more effective and more efficient as well. Having a plan for what are you going to do if folks are disagreeing? What's the plan for resolving conflicts so that you don't have to sit and listen to two people argue for 45 minutes of your meeting time? How are you going to help address that? What are you going to do in terms of kind of following up? That's an important component. So having, again, this comes back to the roles, having someone who is your meeting notes taker and your the person who's kind of helping you track the agenda. Also having clear action items that you're walking away from that meeting. Using a summary format might help. So having 5 minutes at the end of the meeting to kind of designate and say, look, this is what we talked about. This is what everybody said they're going to do. Do we agree on this? If so, we've got our plan to move forward. And then actually following up on those action items afterwards can really be helpful for kind of getting this type of structure in place to help facilitate your meetings. All right, next slide.
Speaking of summing up.
So yeah, exactly, perfect timing there. So just as a quick recap, we've covered a lot of different topics quickly today. So talking about the role of virtual teams, virtual work, the balance of the advantages over the challenges, and what it is that we can all kind of do as leaders to help address these different challenges. So the technology aspects, the training, the transnationality, being aware of communication issues and challenges, building that trust and psych safety, and really letting folks take over and help out and empowering your team to take charge themselves. So quick couple best practices that we've hit on here include that team contract, which I think is such an important thing. And one thing just that I think it might help with that is keeping in mind that is also a living document. So think of it as something that you can continue to grow and develop in terms of kind of expanding and building on, and maybe learning from those different problems or issues that may come up, what needs to go in that team contract. You may have things that come up along the way. So thinking about it as, this is something that we will revisit. This is something that we will, adapt and adjust over time as needed. Really like the, obviously the empowering component, and then different things to keep in mind for planning your team meetings, and how to kind of think about the structure that you want to put in place for those. All right, so next slide. This is our last one here. Okay, so just one thing we wanted to see was just kind of for everyone. Oh, to give us, again, using that chat feature one last time, what's something that you'd like to take away from the workshop today? What is something you'd like to get out of this workshop? So feel free to add your comments there, and I'll see if I can adjust a couple of answer a couple of the comments here.
Yeah, one of them was the max meeting time and the number of people that should be in an effective meeting.
Yeah.
Marissa, you wrote a paper about this?
Well, the max meeting time is just more so in terms of, I think that's where the planning of the agenda really comes into play. So, but I also, one thing that's come up is making sure to, thinking about scheduling meetings for less than an hour. There's a tendency for folks to want to schedule a meeting for an hour or, always, or an hour and a half, kind of using those 30-minute marks. And I think this is where if you start to plan out your agenda and you can start to get an idea of, oh, okay, this maybe it's that we only need a 50-minute meeting, and maybe that's what you should schedule. And so that also gives your team a little bit of a break. So I think that trying not to always just assume that an hour is what is needed. Really think about what it is you want to accomplish and use that to drive your length. I would also recommend, because this kind of goes with the number of attendees, again, it's what's the purpose of your meeting? Are you trying to convey information? Thinking again, what's your agenda? What's your plan there? If you want to convey information and you're not trying to get a lot of input from folks, meeting size can maybe much larger. If you were trying to have a meaningful conversation, a discussion, and reach an agreement on something, well, it should be the folks who are the decision makers, or it should be the folks who have a role or have some type of stake in that conversation. So I think those are the things to think about in terms of driving your meeting size and your meeting time for that in particular.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great. Well, thanks everyone. This has been fun to share, and happy to answer any additional questions or any additional comments or feedback. And I think maybe Chris can answer the slides and recordings being made available.
Yeah, they are.
There. Yes.
Awesome. Looks like you all got a lot out of this, and keep an eye out for the other team skills workshops coming up in the near future. They'll be more focused on particular, well, I mean, this is pretty focused, but multiple focus sessions over the course of a couple months to develop everything from when you're composing your team initially to how do you evaluate performance and provide feedback. So happy to answer any questions you all have. I'm sure Lauren will be in touch with you with all of the slides and recording of the session. Seeing as there are no questions, you have our contact information if you have any. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I think I can end this meeting now that I am co-host. So thanks for attending, and see you later.
Thanks everybody.